Hello. Today we're going to be looking at the Bush administration. And when I say the Bush administration, I should clarify, I'm not talking about George W. Bush, but rather his father, George H.W. Bush, who at the time was simply known as George Bush. He had been Reagan's vice president for the two terms that Reagan served as president from 1981 until 1989. So in the 1988 presidential election, George H.W. Bush ran against Michael Dukakis, the Democratic nominee, and won that nomination. He served one term from 1989 to 1993, so he kind of sees that bridge into the early 1990s. Our learning objectives are to explain how the collapse of the Soviet Union affected U.S. foreign policy. And so once again, we start by looking at George H.W. Bush. Once again, he had been the vice president during the Reagan administration. He won the presidency in 1988, taking 54% of the popular vote, which is pretty much a landslide. Most elections tend to be much closer, more like 51 to 49 or less. So a 54 percent to probably roughly 46% gaps, a pretty big victory. He defeated Michael Dukakis, taking 426 electoral votes, but the Democrats retained control of Congress. And that also becomes a bit of an issue for him because during the campaign, he made a campaign promise in which he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." That campaign promise really kind of came back to bite him in the rear because the Democrats kind of painted him into a corner. Here he's made this promise to have no new taxes, and ultimately without a tax increase they were going to shut down the government. He conceded to the tax increase, and of course then that's thrown back in his face in the 1992 election. Other factors in that 1988 election: Jesse Jackson became the first African American to make a serious bid for the presidency, finishing second to Dukakis in the Democratic primaries. And Jackson worked to build a rainbow coalition by attempting to gain the support of minorities and the poor. So early on, we already had been experiencing changes in the Soviet Union during the Reagan administration. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, and Gorbachev really was looking to try to save the Soviet Union, so he brought in a whole new era of change. To fix the problems with the Soviet economy, he used perestroika, or restructuring, and basically allowing more elements of free enterprise. He's trying to ultimately save the Soviet Union from its imminent collapse. He also promoted glasnost, or openness, allowing greater freedom of religion and speech. Now, ultimately, these changes that are positive steps that were intended to save the Soviet Union actually helped contribute to its collapse. This mostly happens there. These mostly peaceful revolutions take place because Gorbachev announces that he's abandoning the Brezhnev doctrine, something that one of his predecessors, Leonid Brezhnev, had ushered or had stated, which basically it's something the Soviets already were doing, but it was basically the policy of supporting communist governments where they were threatened. And so ultimately the Soviets had suppressed uprisings in some Eastern European countries, most notably Poland and Hungary. So with Gorbachev announcing that he's abandoning the Brezhnev doctrine, in effect, these communist governments of Eastern Europe are on their own. They can no longer draw upon the Soviets for military support to put down uprisings. And that really helps kind of push these peaceful revolutions, really starting with democratic governments in Poland, where a trade union named Solidarity, led by Lech Walesa, really helped usher in change. The Catholic Church also played a major role in Poland. And ultimately what happens is that Lech Walesa, who is the leader of Solidarity, becomes elected president. Other countries follow, including Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. The Berlin Wall is torn down in 1989. and then Germany is formally reunited in 1990. So, all of that's happening during the first year that Bush is in office. Gorbachev survived an attempted coup through the help of Boris Yeltsin, who becomes the Russian leader, the leader of the Russian Republic. And the coup was attempted by hardliners within the Soviet government that were resisting his reforms. Other republics declared that their independence from the Soviet Union, most notably Belarus and Ukraine. Eventually, in November of 1991, Gorbachev says the Soviet Union no longer exists. And so Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia, now led an independent Russian Federation, and the Cold War is now officially over. So this brings in kind of a new world order. We really have a new way to look at world events. We're no longer in the Cold War, which has really defined how we've looked at everything over the last 45 years since the end of World War II. Now we've got to look at things differently. We're no longer in this struggle for influence with the Soviets. So with the end of the Cold War, Bush said that there was a new world order, and the anti-communist movement spread from Europe across to China. Also during this time, we see that as these movements spread into China, a lot of the Chinese students leading the movements, they don't really know what they're pushing for. They know that they want change, though. They're unhappy with the communist government. And so this leads to a very harsh crackdown, particularly pertaining to the protests that take place in Tiananmen Square in the capital of Beijing. And this leads to what kind of becomes known as the Tiananmen Square Massacre. Tanks and troops are sent in to put down the protest. And we also have this very iconic image of a lone man standing up to a tank. A whole row of tanks are rolling into Tiananmen Square. And here he is, simply a man holding a briefcase, waving his arms, standing in front of the tanks, blocking their path. And they kind of become a little bit confused, don't really seem to know what to do. They try to go around him. He continues to move into their path. Eventually, he's kind of escorted or pushed away from the scene, and we don't really know what happened to him. Some people end up being put to death, and there was a lot of criticism directed at China at this point in time. Many people believe that he was assassinated for taking the action that he did. And we just don't know that to be a fact, but it's highly likely that he was executed under the orders of the Chinese government, because facing all the criticism that they were facing, they probably would have produced him if he was still alive, just to verify that they didn't kill him. So the most likely scenario is that he was executed. Nonetheless, that image really came to symbolize that movement. There were also some other military entanglements with the end of the Cold War. One of the military entanglements we got involved in was in Panama. Particularly what had gone on there in Panama is that we had brokered a treaty. This really had been set up by former President Jimmy Carter. When he was president, he had negotiated and pushed through these treaties that would turn over control of the Panama Canal to Panama by the year 2000. And then so, here we are as we're moving into the 1990s, and Panama is a country that their dictator, Manuel Noriega, is involved in drug trafficking. He's cooperating less and less with the United States, and so eventually we decide to arrest him on drug trafficking charges. And so, we help we actually kind of set up an invasion force that goes in. The American troops kind of quickly topple their government, arrest Noriega, and kind of help set up a new government. Noriega is brought to the United States to face drug trafficking charges. And then we help Panama to set up new elections, although of course this does become rather controversial.